Hi all, Frank, aka Boot Barrister here. We've got a tiny bit of drama in the boot world. The chief parties involved are Oak Street bootmakers and the Federal Trade Commission, which hereinafter will be referred to as the FTC. However, within the last few days, it appears that Viberg has chimed in and suggested that they may be involved in this matter in one form or another. Now, this channel is not about drama. Do not take anything I say as adding to or subtracting from anything that may or may not be going on behind the curtains with third parties or with government entities. With this particular video, I'm merely looking at any facts that I am aware of to give my opinion in a cursory and speculative analysis. A couple of shout outs before we get started. My first mention goes to Ryan at Yushu, that I am aware he was the very first channel to report on the first of these issues and deserves all due credit. Please check out his video reporting on this, which I'll try to link below along with his channel. I also want to mention EDH Boulevard, whose channel I'll also try to link below. I really enjoy talking about this stuff and figured why not relax with a nice cold drink, especially during these summer months. My thanks to Gabe for his inspiration. Both of the guys I mentioned make solid boot-related content, and I recommend that you check them out. With that out of the way, the topic at hand. Oak Street Boots versus the FTC versus Viberg. Allegedly on the Viberg part, which I'll touch upon at service level shortly. I'm going to proceed in three parts. First, I'll discuss the first of two controversies, giving my thoughts on the FTC letter that was delivered to Oak Street, expanding a bit on what Yushu talked about. Second, I'll discuss the second controversy, specifically the unconfirmed dispute that appears to have manifested between Oak Street and Viberg shortly after the FTC issue. Lastly, you may or may not have noticed that I have a box sitting here in front of me. With Oak Street dramatically dropping the price of the apparently controversial Storm boot to $324, 50% off on final sale, I decided to take a gamble and try it. Being that the boot is non-returnable, I can only hope for the best. You'll find out with me shortly. So, let's get to the first controversy. Before I begin, a quick disclaimer. I want to make it unequivocally clear that nothing stated here constitutes legal advice, and thus it should not in any way be taken as such. Should Oak Street, or indeed any other entity that is experiencing a similar issue, come across this video, such entity should not assess its compliance or requirements concerning any law or regulation based on this video. Instead, it is my strong recommendation that said entity contact an attorney who can provide advice in addressing its legal issue or responsibilities. That said, in July, the FTC sent a compliance warning to Oak Street, apparently taking issue with Oak Street essentially labeling various of its products as wholly made in the USA. I'll quickly note some of the letter's highlights. First, it seems evident that someone dropped a dime on Oak Street, as it appears that Oak Street only came onto the FTC's radar because the FTC, quote-unquote, received information that several of Oak Street's products, including the Storm boot, may be, quote-unquote, wholly imported or may contain significant imported content. Second, I think it's important to note that this letter is just a compliance warning. There is no indication of an actual investigation, at least not yet. Rather, and this is the third thing I'll highlight about the letter, the FTC has merely requested that Oak Street demonstrate its compliance with Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act, or FTCA, the statute at issue specifically being 15 U.S.C. Section 45A1, which gives the FTC jurisdiction over, quote, unfair methods of competition in or affecting commerce, and unfair or deceptive acts or practices in or affecting commerce, which are hereby declared unlawful, close quote. Lastly, the letter suggests that if Oak Street does demonstrate its compliance, which it may already have, as there have been some changes to Oak Street's website, the FTC may leave them be. Specifically, the letter states that the alleged violations, quote, could subject Oak Street to legal action, with no firm commitment to take any additional investigative or remedial steps. So, What is Oak Street's problem here? Well, it's the powerful FTC. I did just a tiny bit of research and will try to keep this digestible. The United States Congress has plenary authority to regulate commerce between the states pursuant to the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution. Don't take the word states ultra-literally, as this authority applies to states, but also extends to state citizens and beyond. Through this authority, Congress has empowered the FTC to act under the FTCA. So then, how might Section 45A1, which we mentioned earlier, be read? As taken from an example U.S. Court of Appeals case, under the FTCA, the FTC is empowered and directed to prevent persons, partnerships, or corporations from using unfair methods of competition in or affecting commerce and unfair or deceptive acts or practices in or affecting commerce. Moreover, in exercising their jurisdiction, the FTC has, open quote, broad authority. That's probably the reason why most of the cases I glanced at sided with the FTC. Okay, so we have a basic understanding of this aspect of the FTC's jurisdiction. But how does the statute itself potentially subject a company like Oak Street to legal action? Well, the ball starts in the FTC's court. The standard provides that, open quote, the FTC must demonstrate that 1, there was a representation, 2, the representation was likely to mislead customers acting unreasonably under the circumstances, and 3, the representation was material, close quote. In explaining whether a representation is material, the example case I looked at notes that, open quote, a representation is material if it is likely to affect a consumer's decision to buy a product or service, close quote. Let me know what you think in the comments. Does whether a boot or shoe is constructed in the United States factor on whether or not you might purchase it? So, why exactly did Oak Street's Made in America USA claims create issues? Well, as noted in another example case that explained the broad policy positions of the FTC, when a product is unqualifiedly claimed to be made in the USA, it, open quote, must in fact all or virtually all be made in the United States, close quote. A product meets this standard if, open quote, all significant parts and processing that go into the product are of U.S. origin, close quote, and, open quote, the final assembly or processing of the product takes place in the United States, close quote. There are a couple of more nuanced requirements, but those are the substantive requirements for what constitutes made in the USA. Without getting too much into the weeds here, and while noting that I'm not an expert here, I'll add a couple of thoughts. First, since the standard is all or virtually all, does that mean that a boot can still be considered made in the USA, even if it contains a minority of non-domestic components? The answer seems to be yes, but the complication there is that the cases suggest there isn't an exact percentage of U.S. to domestic components to indicate whether a product meets this standard. Second, I think the final assembly language noted by the courts is concerning, since it may potentially permit a substantial amount of the product to be assembled elsewhere as long as the final bit of the assembly occurs in the U.S. But perhaps there's more nuance to that. Looking at the FTC letter and subsequent Oak Street website updates, it appears that the issue was that Oak Street unqualifiedly claimed that their products were made in the USA. Their recent update isn't necessarily an admission to anything. It could simply be that they hadn't consulted an attorney or an FTCA specialist to better understand what is required of the Made in USA designation. And while we in the book community may have an idea of what we want Made in the USA to mean, there were a few court cases where entities claimed that the Made in USA standard was ambiguous. Of course, Oak Street's approach could have been intentional, but it's also possible that there was some level of confusion on their part. In any case, under Oak Street's new Made in the US approach, they continue to assert that their products are in some form or manner made in the US, but now qualify that the products include both foreign and domestic components. Time will tell if this satisfies the FTC. So, on to the second controversy. Shortly after the FTC issue came about, there appears to have been a little social media spat between Oak Street and Viberg. This started when Viberg posted a series of social media stories which allege that certain luxury footwear makers were engaging in questionable business practices, including making false Made in America claims. Viberg did not exactly call Oak Street out by its name, but it's hard not to conclude that Oak Street is who Viberg is referring to, in light of Viberg's not-so-subtle mention of, open quote, the Chicago-based boot brand, close quote. Viberg's third story contains some concerning allegations, namely that the Chicago brand's footwear at issue was mostly manufactured in the Dominican Republic, with just the sole having been attached in the United States. Finally, in implying that they were the true originator of the product, Viberg claimed that the product at issue was well made and probably the finest that the Chicago company had to offer. Oak Street, apparently concluding that they were the target of the posts, responded with their own series of social media stories. They too do not call Viberg out by name, but since Viberg's posts had been written out in a heavier font, and Oak Street points out, open quote, headlines being made in 24 point, close quote, in a nuanced way, it seems that Viberg is who they were referring to. Oak Street's posts essentially take nuanced shots at Viberg for allegedly having an ad agency, PR firm, photographers, and passing on those costs by overcharging customers a, open quote, perceived, close quote, value for their boots. Oak Street didn't say much to directly address Viberg's claims, except to suggest that real facts would come out later. Very mysterious. I want to briefly cover a couple of observations. First, I find it interesting that Viberg appears to have a bit of inside information about some of what's happening at Oak Street. If so, I can't help but wonder how they got the information. I also can't help but wonder if they're the party that dropped the dime on Oak Street. Oak Street has not been particularly transparent about their manufacturing process, so I imagine that this information is not readily available. Second, I wonder under what terms Viberg's former plant manager's employment ended. If under bad terms, I wonder if the manager was incentivized to somehow hurt Viberg by using Viberg's lasts and patterns. Was there a non-compete or anything involved? Third, I wonder what, if any, copyright issues are involved here. Are there any trade secrets involved? As I understand it, Viberg has some type of copyright on some form of their service boot. I wonder if the Storm boot somehow touched upon that copyright, and if that's the reason why the boot now appears to be completely discontinued, even though it just recently came out. Fourth, I can't help but wish that Oak Street was more transparent about the manufacturing process. If Viberg's nuanced allegation about manufacturing in the DR, with the exception of the sole, is true, then my concern about the final assembly language in the FTC standard is merited. Look, in my opinion, it's okay for shoes and boots to be internationally manufactured, assuming it's done humanely. Companies like Grant Stone, Parkhurst, and Thursday are doing very well despite manufacturing their products internationally. There is a space in the boot world for overseas manufacturing, and if it's happening at Oak Street, perhaps they should consider simply admitting it and finding ways to make it a strength. Okay, on to the final and best part of the video. It's new boot day. Now, I didn't need this boot, but $324 for a hand-welted, stitched-down boot that uses quality leather and brand-name components, I was willing to take a shot, Viberg knockoff or not. However, if you watched Yushu's video, you'll see that he sort of landed a lemon of a boot, which he ultimately returned as I understand it. Well, I purchased this with the understanding that it's a final sale, so I'm stuck with it. If it ends up being a bad copy, my only recourse is to either deal with it or sell it. What I'll say is that, like Yushu suggested, I have the opportunity to assess this boot from the perspective of a $324 boot, and in that respect, by no means does it need to be perfect. And because I didn't really need this boot, and assuming I didn't land a lemon of a boot, I kind of figured out a nuanced use for it. Since I didn't have this particular colorway for this purpose, I think this boot will enter service within my rotation of casual Friday work boots. Side note, that's the topic of a future video. Okay, so let's check these out. This little Kershaw Launch 4 will likely be my unboxing knife going forward, so you'll be seeing it again. Okay, here we go. Get rid of that paperwork. Some instructions for care for the boots. Got one of the boot bags. Oak Street's the only one I've ever seen package their boots like so. And here's the first boot. Go ahead and take it out. It's the Storm boot in color 8, Chrome XL. First impressions. So far, this boot looks fine. No obvious defects to the leather. Maybe a little tiny bit of loose grain right over here, but not a big issue that I can tell. Stitch work appears to be good. Not quite like what Yushu got in his version of the boot. Why don't we check out the other one? Okay, maybe a tiny bit of loose gain here on the toe area. Other than that, no obvious defects to the leather. Looks like there's a little bit of overlapping stitch here on the double row stitch down, so I guess you can consider that maybe somewhat of an issue. Probably won't affect the wearability of the boot, but not perfect, obviously. Okay, well, there you go. I almost neglected to mention, they included a couple extra goodies with the boot. Okay, we've got a brush here. It's a nice touch. Some rawhide laces. And a little Venetian shoe cream. All right, not too bad, kind of cool. Okay, so overall not bad. As others have said, I don't love this particularly thin tongue. I think that may be a failure point down the road, but time will tell. Otherwise, not too bad. I think I'll probably keep them. Now, this is just an unboxing and first look, not a review. Maybe that will come later. But I wanted to quickly bring out a special boot in the same colorway, just to briefly look at them one-on-one. This is Viberg's 2030 service boot, also in color 8 Chrome XL. The key differences between the two boots is a day-night sole versus this Vibram sole, and the Bro cap toe on the Viberg. The lasts, you guys tell me what you think. I suppose they look similar. Can't say for certain that they're the same, but they do look similar. I'm not going to get deep into it, but the finishing does appear to be superior on the Viberg at eye level. Leather looks cleaner, stitching looks cleaner. Stitching is also a little bit tighter, in my opinion, on the Viberg as compared to the Oak Street. Hopefully my camera picks that up. That said, this is decent work. Perhaps except for the slightly overlapping portion here on the Oak Street. It's not a terrible stitch work. Hey everyone, just a quick follow-up before the video ends. I've had a better chance to look at the boots after the initial part of the video was recorded, and there are some quality issues for sure. First off, that same issue that Yushu had with the insole. I'm not quite sure if it's a true insole or if it's a combination insole and midsole. I'll assume it's an insole, but it doesn't seem that it was finished particularly well, and it seems that it's one area of the boot where there just wasn't a lot of attention given to. It's fairly jagged feeling, not smooth, and it certainly doesn't look very good either. So that certainly takes away from the boot. You'll see in this next picture the exceptional thinness of the tongue. I'm not sure why they did this, but it's certainly something that could be improved on. It's something that I've not experienced with Oak Street in the prior products that I had. So definitely takes away from the quality of the boot. Something I think they should work on in the future for sure. You'll see in this next picture that same weird slope that Yushu experienced in his boots, going from the midsole through the outsole, is present in this boot. Doesn't take away from the wearability of the boot, I don't think, but certainly a little weird looking. You'll notice in this next picture that there appears to be a blown stitch towards the rear heel. Not sure what happened there. Perhaps the needle caught part of the midsole and stitched it on through the outsole. Very weird for sure. And lastly, I just want to give a closer look of the loose grain that I was seeing in one of the toes of the boots. Just a really bad area to put this cut of leather on. Not sure what they were thinking in that regards. Definitely takes away from the boot. Not sure what else to say about that. So for $324, I think I'll probably still end up keeping it. Not sure I'd get much on my return by going out and trying to sell it. What I will say is that this was never a $650 boot. So I think it is probably appropriately priced at $325, if not less. The only other thing I can say to Oak Street is that whoever you had made these boots, my strong recommendation is that you replace them with someone who's going to make a better product for you. If you're going to charge prices competing with $600 boot companies, you need to deliver that kind of quality, in my opinion, and these boots are not it. We've come to the end of the video. I thank everyone for watching. I'm trying to grow this channel, so if you would be so inclined, please like and subscribe. Have a good day, everyone.